My name is Ainehi Edoro. I am a professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison in the English department, and I am also the founder of Brittle Paper, a media platform for African literature. And Alexis, would you mind introducing yourself?
Of course. My name is Alexis Okeowo. I'm a staff writer at The New Yorker. I also write for other publications. Blessings and Disasters is my second book. The first is called A Moonless, Starless Sky, Ordinary Women and Men Fighting Extremism in Africa. It won the 2018 PEN Open Book Award.
We're really delighted to have you here today. Can you please help me welcome her with a good round of applause? And I also wanted to just use this opportunity to again thank the conveners of this beautiful, safe, generative space that we've been in the past 2 days. Thank you so much for making space for us and for our work. And we love you guys. Okay, so we are discussing Alexis' new book, A Story of Alabama, Blessings and Disasters. And I did a thing where I started reading the book before I read the jacket. It's just something I do sometimes because I couldn't really tell what the book was about from the cover or from the title, and I just wanted to kind of lean into that mystery. And it turned out to be a very illuminating read. And like I told Alexis when we were discussing at the Green Room, I've never read anything like this before. And I am really delighted to share with you guys, kind of just what the questions that came up for me from reading this book. But to get us started, let's kind of situate the audience for those people who may not know what the book is about. You're telling a story about the South that many people are not familiar with, or that many people have sort of stereotyped away from their awareness. What inspired you to go on this journey to tell this new or different story of the American South?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I feel like for a lot of my career, which I have spent writing about the continent, that was part of the work I was doing, was trying to write about places that I felt like had been stereotyped or ignored, and trying to write about them with nuance. And then it wasn't until sort of years later that I realized the place I was from, my hometown, my home, also suffered from this story, from the sort of lack of nuance, from a singular story being told that didn't include me or my family or people I knew. And I thought, if anyone is gonna write this story, why not me? Just to, again, tell a more nuanced story, but in a way that was personal, because it is more personal for me, because this is where I grew up. And I thought, how can I meld this sort of journalistic mission with also the personal mission I had?
So when I read those moments where you address the stereotypes that people have of the American South, I try to think back to when I was in Nigeria, because sometimes it's the litmus test for me. I'm just like, what did I think when I was 16 years old? Watching Hollywood movies and somebody with a southern accent comes up. Like in that my universe, right, of very like limited knowledge of the US, like what did the South appear like to me? And I realized that, of course, as Nollywood is like the industry of producing stereotypes, right? That I did think I had ideas about the American South even before I came here. But what would you say are some of the stereotypes that Americans have of the South?
Yeah, I mean, I think the South is a place that is defined by the extremeness of its past. So people tend to think, oh, this is a place that's very racist, it's backwards, it's extremely religious, it's deeply conservative and just sort of the most regressive of pieties take hold there. And that's not to say that there are not aspects of those things, but it's those things plus other things. And then, it's also defined by the sort of black-white racial conflict that understandably has taken so much up of its history, but that also erases so many other groups and people that call the South home.
Yeah, it's interesting that you use your work combating mischaracterizations of Africa as an analogy to this project, which is kind of addressing the mischaracterizations of the South. And at some point, you even talk about yourself as having to look at the South as a foreigner. Like, can you just kind of, reflect for us a little bit on that analogy, right? The way that, because that's an analogy that I know. I came to the US 19 years old, Morgan State University, historically black college, which was the safest place I could land in a country like this. But I still experience this idea that, people had all kinds of stereotypes about Africa. But for someone who has sort of spent her career really writing amazing, beautiful work about the continent, can you kind of help us think more about that analogy?
When I was working on it, especially the more time I spent away from the South, because of the stereotypes and conversations that are prevalent, I began to sort of think of it as a foreign country. It began to feel less familiar. I began to sort of doubt some of the things I knew about it. And in some ways, it is a foreign country. And so I think when I went back spending time, and not just visiting my parents, not just hanging out with friends, but actually trying to spend time with different people who call Alabama home, vastly different people, it was helpful to think about it as a foreign country in some ways. Because while I was connecting with my subjects and saying, yes, I grew up here, there are certain things I didn't understand about their experience, whether it was because of their racial background, maybe they grew up in a more rural setting than I did. And so I think that helped me because it made me realize I actually don't know as much about this place as I thought I did. I have a lot to learn. When I'm spending time with the chief of Alabama's only federally recognized tribe, and I'm going down to their reservation, I'm like, I know nothing about this place, even though we grew up we lived in the same state. And so I need to bring that rigorousness to this, to sort of telling the story of these Creek Indians who are my neighbors, or were my neighbors, but who I don't really know much about.
That's making me think about my own world, to see what worlds within my world am I not aware of? And how is that maybe limiting my understanding of that space and even my stakes, in some of the larger questions and conflicts that drive it. But I feel like it's maybe a lesson that we can all learn,
Yeah, even, again, completing this book and really trying to spend a cross-section with Alabamans, from Creek Indians to descendants of, white Confederate soldiers, to descendants of Black civil rights activists, to Latino immigrants. There's still so much more, I feel like, that's underneath the surface of all of these people's experiences. And as we talked about, even my parents' experiences. Who met as students in Alabama, after each emigrating separately from Nigeria. There's still so much underneath.
Like so much to unpack, because we were discussing how sometimes we don't think a lot about how worlds exist generationally. So the way you see Alabama would be different from the kind of story that your dad would tell. So even by the time we begin to factor in perspectives like this, our worlds are multiverses, and I just wish we could have the language, the means, the form, the tool to really even even the technology to really like explore these worlds. But I feel like that's what your book is trying to do, you know? So since you're talking about, you've mentioned your dad and your mom, maybe we can kind of read a passage and then we can continue that conversation.
Just going to read 2 paragraphs, just explaining a little bit about my family's location within Alabama. My family is also Black American, of course, but our origin story is different from the family across the street. My mother and father immigrated separately to the United States from different parts of Nigeria, and then met as college students in the close social circle of West Africans at Alabama State University, a historically Black college in Montgomery. They were simultaneously part of and outside the Black-white racial binary that has long defined the state, replacing the native settler binary that burned into the humanity sometime after Alabama joined the Union in 1819 and removed most of its native residents by putting them onto the Trail of Tears. My parents and their friends were familiar and foreign, Black but other, an insular world unto themselves in Alabama in the 1970s. In those muggy days at the end of the fever of the Civil Rights Movement, amid desegregation and increasing globalization and competition for students, public universities in the Deep South were offering financial aid to the most eager and unsuspecting, Black Africans. My parents had hesitations, but they went. They existed along the fault line of a shared white and Black distrust of Black foreigners, but they had seen opportunity in Alabama and seized it. My brothers and I had to do the same. It was a ruthless stance. Sacrifice and discipline bred success. We had pride in knowing we also belonged to a Nigerian story that predated our American one, and that was our refuge. When my parents each first moved to Alabama, my mother directly from southern Nigeria, my dad after a year at a private college in Berkeley, California, they had coinciding perceptions of the state. My dad couldn't afford another year at his college, so he opened a directory of state schools and landed on one of the first on the list. He knew Alabama had ongoing racial troubles, but he saw a chance to get an education relatively cheaply. My mom's sister was already attending college in Alabama, and my mother saw it as a place where she could too, while being near family. They found that education, along with friends, kids, apartments, cars. Those things also became a refuge. They plunged into Alabama blind and surfaced with a new home.
I mean, that kind of captures the experience of coming from Nigeria to the US, but not landing in the typical places, not New York City or Chicago or Houston, right?
Exactly.
Or Atlanta, but ending up in Alabama. I think when I read that portion of your book, and also all the moments where you mentioned your family, I wondered what your dad thought of the book. Has he read the book?
He has, a few times. Because I think, especially the first time, it was, even though I interviewed my parents, it was strange for him. My father is also a journalist. I think it was a bit strange and maybe uncomfortable for him to see this part of his life narrated by his child. And of course, I'm writing my own words. I have my own thoughts and perspective. I'm interpreting in a certain way, in a way that I don't think he would have perhaps interpreted. And so it prompted more conversations where I, really tried to get it as right as I could about his experience, while also knowing that there is more that he can only tell. I also think, for a long time, I thought their experience being at HBCU in Alabama was different. I thought when I was growing up, it was this sort of happy-go-lucky, yeah, they were in Alabama, but they were in all-Black college. I'm sure it was just perfect. And then realizing, of course, it was actually more strange and uncomfortable than that.
Yeah. And I think it's a very complicated relationship, and it speaks to the points you make in the reading, where you say that that your dad and your mom were kind of both inside and outside the binary of the black-white conflict, and also the kind of white-native conflict. Can you maybe unpack that strange form of outsideness, where you're both inside and outside this thing, that preceded you?
Yeah, I mean, I actually quote my dad at some point saying that, it was the experience of not feeling included, but partly because their Black American peers didn't really know what to do with them. They already had, there was already so much to worry about in terms of their relationship with white Alabamians, that there was a sense of, it was almost like an extra appendage, or like a third limb, like how do we relate to these people? And I think, but as a result, that causes some alienation on the other side, that causes mutual misunderstanding. And relating to my own experience, of course, that was diluted more because I was first gen, but some of that was still there a little bit.
You say that that knowing that you're having this family, these parents from Nigeria, there was a way that was a kind of, a coordinate of refuge. Yeah. Let me put it that way, yeah. Within the context of being in the U.S. as yeah. well. I think one of the really beautiful intervention of this book is actually, in a way, also telling those stories that nobody knows what to do with, right? So when you write about the Native American community, right, one of the points that you made is that literally the U.S., they just never knew what to do with this world that got in the way of a certain kind of pristine national story of discovery and conquest, right? And also a story of just like, kind of the typical nationalist narrative, that Native Americans kind of burst that bubble a bit, and that historically the U.S. literally has never really known what to do with this group. And that's so in the book, there are just all these stories where you're kind of revisiting these worlds where some of them don't quite fit. Can you maybe help us think a little bit about that obliqueness, yeah. What it means to be in those spaces where, you are inside, you're outside?
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. And I think that was one of the foremost missions of this book, is all these stories that don't quite fit, and so as a result are left out or ignored. How do we put that back into the main story? That was one of the missions. So starting from the Native Americans who didn't get on the Trail of Tears, who are actually still around, but who I didn't grow up knowing about, but are actually one of the most prosperous groups in the state, to, again, what's outside of the black-white binary, immigrants, and not just African immigrants, but the more recent Latino immigrants who I also spent time with, who are really the face of Southern agriculture right now. It's not the white good old boy farmer, it's the Latino farmhands who, despite the fact that the South has tried to push them out, stick around and are kind of revitalizing the rural areas. And it's even people like this white woman, Tina, who I spent time with, who is white but grew up very working class, poor actually, and is kind of struggling when she came out during Me Too against a Southern politician, is pushing it back against these very ingrained ideas of Southern womanhood and gender relations, and as a result is not exactly fitting into this idea of Southern womanhood anymore. And then, going back to my experience, growing up in Alabama, but feeling like an insider outsider, but also thinking realizing now that is an advantage. That is what has guided everything I've written about, I think, yeah.
I mean, I love that perspective so much. And it's just, it's beautiful because it's the story that you've told, but it's also the kind of the form itself and the project. You know, I think as a literary scholar, when I see something, I'm asking, yes, the thing is interesting, but how can we take it and then use it to see other things or to do other things? There's even just this idea that, you know, we all don't like stereotypes, right? But sometimes we don't always know how to combat it, how to think beyond it or outside of it or against it. And this is a model, right? So what you do is you look for those stories that don't fit, right? You put them together in the same space, and the tension that happens becomes, you know, the force against a kind of stereotypical imaginary.
Right. I mean, yes, that was the goal. Like, how do we bring those stories and then make it into one? And in the context of the book, the way to do that structure, I felt like bringing in myself, you know.
Tell us about that.
Yeah.
And so at what point was it always going to be through the lens of your experience?
No. I mean, so the book was originally pitched this idea of telling a quote-unquote sort of alternate history guided by the stories of these other people, these other Alabamians I spend time with, sort of a vast cross-section, about 5 people. And then sort of bolstered by history and context. And then it became clear, though, that readers needed to know who the person was who was telling them about these people, and why I was the one doing it. And so that's when I started to sort of pull moments from my history, and then also decided to interview my parents. And then it sort of, I think it helped. Yeah.
Oh, it definitely helped. I feel like I could see a scholarly work being done, you know, like a kind of, and my friend here, Bhakti, I don't know if she's here, she keeps making fun of the monograph. You know, in academic world, at least in the humanities, we write monographs, like your first book is going to be like a monograph. And she keeps making fun of this, like very just like form, you know, that decides to focus on one thing through this like very scholarly lens. I could see somebody doing something like that, but it just wouldn't have the same kind of, maybe we should talk about the stories, because when I wanted to say that, I felt something the way I felt when I read Calvin's story. At the end of that story, I was like kind of undone, you know? So let's talk about Calvin's story. Can you like set it up for people in the audience so that they get a sense of what it's about?
Yeah, so around the time I first started this book, I was actually doing some reporting. It was around the time that the country, various parts of the country had started taking down Confederate memorials. I had gone to a rally in a park in Alabama where, in defiance, they were putting up a new one. And, you know, when I got there, people started coming up to me, telling me, you know, why it was important, the Confederate legacy, why it wasn't racist, you know. And so, and in the South, it's so, because this book is a lot about the stories people tell about themselves, the stories people tell about a place. Crucial to the Southern story is this idea of the Confederate legacy. And so I wanted one of my subjects to be someone who had a strong connection to it, but also someone who I could actually talk to. Someone who was actually open and, you know, who we could disagree, but at least we could talk. And so that was probably the hardest person to find. I went to the rally, there was no one really there. And then I ended up hanging out at this museum in Alabama called the Confederate Memorial Park. I drove there. I didn't really know what I was going to do, but I was hanging around. And then someone came up to me and asked if they could help me. And it was the director of this museum. And I explained to him what I'm looking for, and he said, oh, okay, I can talk to you. And so it ended up being the first of many conversations about his own personal connections to the Confederacy. He had ancestors fight. He is a Civil War reenactor. but also just about, you know, he's someone who has, who, you know, has gone to the lynching memorial, who could talk about.
He's gone to a lynching memorial?
Oh, yeah, sorry, in Montgomery, there's a now quite famous lynching memorial. Yeah, and he was talking about his experiences going there, and we could talk about sort of slavery and racism, and we still didn't agree on a lot of stuff, but I found it useful to talk to him, someone who's so different from me, someone who I wouldn't be friends with, who I wouldn't, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part, you know, will come in a second to the history of violence and the way that you kind of address that in that encounter. But even before that, I would say the conversation that you had with him, I thought was already kind of disruptive. So I wanted to be very specific about the terms that you used. You said that you wanted to have, quote, a thoughtful conversation with Calvin, you know, and you guys were not going to, you were going to talk about very difficult things like civil rights, slavery, race, and, quote, you were going to explore both the intellectual and the emotional. You know, I mean, things are heated up right now in the political sphere, in the kind of public sphere, right? And there are many people who think that we've kind of lost the ideal of a civil public sphere because literally people cannot talk to each other, right? And just having you position it that way, when you said thoughtful conversation, I'm like, thoughtful conversation with who? The guy who, you know, the director of the Confederate Museum, how can I even imagine having a thoughtful conversation with him? I was like, how is she going to do this? Right? But you actually do, because he is, I mean, you know, he makes some very sketchy arguments, right? But I want to kind of go back to even what it means for you to have that conversation with him. Even the fact that you guys, the kind of stage that you guys sat together and talked. Like, how do you see this being a model for civic conversation today?
Yeah. I mean, I think that part of the problem is that so many people across the political divide, we're suspicious, we're nervous, we're afraid. We don't think that there will be any openness on the other side. You know, one thing that's interesting about the South is I do think people are willing to talk. What then becomes questionable is then whether people are willing to be influenced.
Right.
And so there is a part I talk about in the book, this idea of sort of neighborliness, politeness, which is that, you know, Southerners care a lot about being a good neighbor, about being polite, about, you know, willing to talk. But how much does that matter if the system is like fundamentally, you know, unkind, is fundamentally unneighborly? And I think, so there are a lot of things that play. I think people are more willing to talk, but it's about where is the middle ground now?
Right. I mean, so you guys, by the time you're done, it doesn't seem to me that you convinced him of anything, right? So what are we missing in our attempt at civic exchange? Do we, like, what is a conversation, right? Is the goal to, like, you know, to hear the other person and then say, okay, I have heard, and then we move on? Or is it to make sure the person changes their position, right? Because what you guys accomplished, the fact that you and Calvin could talk, right? Could have very uncomfortable conversations about some really, really horrific things. But where you ended was not, okay, now Calvin is now, you know, he has changed his position that his ancestors were evil people, right? That's so, I don't know, like, what are we missing in the way that we envision what a conversation is with somebody that is very different from us?
Yeah, I mean, coming as a journalist, my inclination is to say that exposure, that hearing each other has to have some value, because as a journalist, I don't expect to change anything. But I value the idea of hearing people's stories and storytelling And, you know, and I think that is also important, like that exchange, the idea of telling one story and being heard. And then hopefully there are other people who are better at knowing how that can translate. And there are people who are good at it, especially in politics, who know how that can translate into actual meaningful change.
Right. And to be fair, this is a conversation you were having with him both of you were having together, just you, right? In this kind of shared space where momentarily, at least you both try to trust each other. It is a completely different thing having this conversation with Calvin on Twitter.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
I don't know. Would you have this conversation with Calvin on Twitter?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it would be a disaster. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So you know, we have to take into account what the space of conversation is, right? And so maybe that's one of the lessons for us, is that there's no one conversation. You know, there are different kinds of conversation, different ways of staging conversations, right? And then how do we kind of explore all these different possibilities to look for a way to actually, you know, talk?
And in person is, I think, always the best.
You said
in person is
in person. I think so. And there was this moment, kind of vulnerable moment, where you mentioned that you met him another time and he was worried about how you were going to represent him. Yeah. Do you think he was happy with the way you represented him?
Well, it was interesting. So we fact-checked with him. This was last summer, and he, you know, heard everything that he was going to say. And he didn't have any qualms. But I think, it is something he's extremely nervous about. Yeah.
Do you want to read another passage?
Sure. Actually, it's something related to this. Part of Alabama's story is that after all the awful... Oh, yeah, sure. 142. Part of Alabama's story is that after all the awful things we've come through, are still going through, as residents are now good neighbors to a fault, trying to show that we're the opposite of our ugly stereotypes. We'll greet you on the street, welcome you inside, offer you something to drink. If I don't wave and say hello back to my parents' neighbors, including the ones with Trump signs on their front lawns, I feel like a bad neighbor. Not long ago, I was with my parents at a casual steakhouse in Montgomery, and a group of young white men came in wearing camouflage print pants. As they walked past us, they made sure to greet my dad, who happened not to be wearing his own camouflage print pants that day. While I was getting a COVID-19 test in a clinic outside my hometown back in 2020, I was struck by how the young white nurse ended every one of her answers to me with a gentle, deferential ma'am. But for a long time in Alabama, being a good neighbor has meant going along to get along, prioritizing relationships over political differences, wanting to be thought of as kind when the system we inhabit is fundamentally unkind.
Thank you for that beautiful reading. You know, so this passage is kind of centered around encounters, right? The neighborly encounter. But I'm also thinking about the encounters that happened as you reached out to these people, you know, kind of, I don't know. You're a journalist, so this is like the work that you do. But for somebody like me, it seems really, truly a mysterious craft, you know, to look for people, meet them, and hear their stories, and then kind of build a world around it. I guess maybe this is a good place for us to talk about the stories themselves. Which of them was the most could be the most difficult, the most pleasant, the most confusing, the weird, you know, the weirdest, just like which of them was the most anything?
I think the most surprising was I knew I wanted to talk to this woman named Tina Johnson, who is this white woman who grew up very poor in northern Alabama and sort of came to prominence because in 2017, she came out during Me Too against Roy Moore, the sort of awful Alabama politician, accused him of sexual assault. And so I was very interested in her. and approaching her. It took her a while to get her contact info. I eventually got it from another journalist. I called her up. I said, could I come visit her? She said, sure. I drove hours to northern Alabama from my parents' home in Montgomery. And yeah, again, the sort of rural part. I didn't know, I mean, when I'm going there, I'm just thinking I'm a journalist. I'm just gonna go interview her. She opens the door, receives me. She's like very uncomfortable, takes me in the kitchen, gives me a plastic cup of water, and I'm thinking, oh God, is this a racial thing? Is she uncomfortable because I'm a black woman in her home? We're sitting down in the living room, and then to sort of break the ice, I'm asking about her family, and she shows me photos, and I see that her husband is black, her stepkids are black, and she just continues to surprise me because, as I said, she was a working class white woman. Her mother couldn't read or write, but she was, scrappy. She experienced a lot of sexual abuse. She had several husbands. The most recent one, and the current one, is black, but all the husbands before that were white. And she just sort of, part of her family she believed was Native American. She just existed at all of these sort of boundaries in Alabama: race, class, gender, and was sort of pushing against all of them in interesting ways. And she was a journalist's dream in terms of just being so open, letting me come back and visit her and really get into her life. And so in a lot of ways, I have a chapter called sort of Forced Intimacy, partly about how, for better or worse, the races in the South have lived more closely together than in any part of the country, just because they were forced to. Right. And she is kind of a product of that. Again, this sort of white working class woman, but who has sort of experienced that kind of intimacy of racially, class-wise gender.
So, I mean, thinking about her, you mentioned earlier that she doesn't fit a certain kind of Southern femininity or Southern ideal of womanhood. In the chapter with Calvin, you go in a little bit into this organization of women who have been really instrumental in mythologizing the Confederate War. In your work, can you maybe comment a bit on kind of what Southern womanhood is, or what that ideology is, and how you kind of saw it being, pushed against?
Yes, because I also spent time with this woman, Mary, who is the daughter of really interesting civil rights activists. She grew up in the Black Belt, kind of became an accidental activist herself. And I contrast these two women experiences, black and white. Mary grew up where she saw a lot of the women in her family who were in the movement, the local civil rights movement, kind of carrying everything. They were supporting their partners, their kids, their parents, and also being very active in the movement and finding it very thankless in a way because all of the burden was on them. And she was like, I'm not gonna do this. And so she actually ended up never married. She never had kids because she just found the sort of the societal expectations of what being a black woman in the South would entail, shouldering everything, was just not what she wanted. And then you had Tina, who was taught that the idea of being a perfect Southern woman is to look perfect, act perfect, and be agreeable, especially to the men in your life. And saw how that didn't protect her. She was still abused by so many men. And until it came to a breaking point, she came out against this politician in 2017 and then experienced the backlash of doing that. And so this idea of, and I think what unified them was this idea of, the Southern woman having it all together and making it look effortless and being agreeable and polite, and them just both realizing that was not going to be the way for both of them.
Yeah. So by the time you came along, right, for your generation, how does that fit into this Southern woman ideal?
I think that idea of perfection still was very powerful. And something like, I know a lot of people are still trying to unlearn this idea that you have to, look like you have everything together, even if you don't. And because, it can be quite oppressive, I think,
I imagine. So maybe we can be a little bit more granular and talk about the journalist's rituals, right? So you mentioned that when you went to Tina's house, you sat down, she gave you water, you began to ask about her life. I mean, it seems like an awkward situation, like a total stranger. And you're coming all this way and you're going to talk about, even uncomfortable things. So just I don't know, as a storyteller, a journalist of that particular, practice, what are your rituals for creating that safe, trusting space for somebody to talk to you?
Yeah. Well, part one is definitely realizing it's not going to happen on the first time you meet them.
Oh, really?
And probably not the second time. And thinking about those, at least that first encounter, more so when you're doing a story and you have less time, as kind of a throat clearing. Okay. Let me introduce you who I am. Let me show you what I'm about. Let's sort of have an intro conversation. We're probably not going to get into anything too deep because that's probably too much the first time. And also to keep that first session, not let it go on too long.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I am surprised by the idea that you go several times. I'm just imagining you go there the first day and then they're just pouring their hearts out to you.
No, because what's interesting is even if they do pour their hearts out that first time, when you go back, there are things that they bring up that you're like, true. Wait, you didn't say that the first time.
That is true. That is true. You can play a little detective work.
In fact, sometimes it's frustrating to the point where it's a year later and you're like, wait, but you didn't tell me that before. Now I got to go back.
Yeah, because I've built this entire chapter
exactly.
around that one thing that you talked about. So if you have questions, begin to kind of get your thoughts together. One of the things that struck me about the way you write is that history is very important to you. Mm-hmm. And when we're talking in the green room, I went back to that moment where you say your dad and your mom, they were sort of inside and outside this binary of black and white, but then you didn't stop there. You then said, but that is also tied to an older binary, which is between white and native. And all through the book is history is very important. I learned way more about the Civil War than I know from reading this book. So I don't know, and in Calvin's chapter as well, the way that you shifted from Calvin's kind of doctored, ideologically framed view of his ancestors to the statistics around lynching and to the violence that is. What is most difficult trying to address a history, the history of violence as a very specific kind of history?
Yeah, I mean, it is crucial to the Southern story. So it was impossible to ignore. And I think my priority was just showing how that violence, the different ways it manifests itself. So whether we're talking about the almost near annihilation of the Creek, or to the forced, migration and enslavement of Africans, or to, the political, the sort of everyday terror following the Civil War and Reconstruction, to the gender, to sort of the underlying sort of gender-based violence, again, whether around Southern womanhood, to the more recent when we're talking about Latino migrants and sort of the effort to have them self-deport or forcibly deport them. As much as I'm trying to sort of show the nuance of these people's stories and talk about the value of the fact that they stuck around, because so much of this book is about why do people stay in a place that doesn't often love them back. Yeah. I needed to show why this place, how this place manifests, how it doesn't love them. And the extremeness of that, and still the fact that these people stick around.
Wow, that's powerful. Why do people stay in a place that doesn't love them back? Yeah, I feel like that is part of one of the knots that you're trying to unravel in this, and which is also tied to the stereotypes as well, right? That people reduce the lives of Southerners, maybe in part because they don't understand how you can persist in a world that has been so unkind to you. At the end of the book, you have further readings. Mm-hmm. And I looked through them, and they are mostly like nonfiction, some scholarly themes as well. I noticed that there is no fiction or poetry. So the teacher in me, I'm going to have an exam question for her. If you had to include fiction or poetry in this further reading list, what will be possibilities? And you don't have to answer. You can think about it while we take questions, and then we can go back to it.
Sounds good, yeah.
Okay. Who has a question to ask? Thank you. I have somebody in front.
So first of all, Alexis, thanks so much for sharing your work. I came to this pretty raw, and I haven't read this book or your other work, but I'm definitely going to dive in. And I'm thinking about this too because I'm a Southerner, so I'm from Atlanta, born and raised. My dad and his people are from Birmingham, connected to Selma. And I remember growing up and going to Birmingham, even as a Southerner, Alabama would have its own feeling, different from Georgia. So I'm interested in if you think that there is some distinctiveness and specificity about what Alabama is and where it's going, that kind of makes it different from other Southern states, and are there aspects that are more generalizable? So do you think there's something distinctive about the history of Alabama that allows you to have conversations about the South and maybe the Black South that other states don't?
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a good question. I think it's interesting. I often say that I feel like Georgia is where Alabama could be if it got itself together. I think one thing that's particular about Alabama is that kind of entrenched resistance. I mean, the way progress happens in Alabama, it's almost like whiplash. There'll be progress, and then just as suddenly there'll be backlash in a way that makes it, I think, unfortunately quite distinctive. And that is part of what interested me in it, is that it is this historical whiplash constantly from, again, birthplace of Confederacy to homo civil rights movement. But perhaps because of that whiplash, that is why I and other people don't lose faith that despite the moments of intense backlash, there won't be, another sort of lurch forward, and that is largely thanks to the people who do stick around, who do stay. And I think that can be said about a lot of the region. Whether you're talking about Mississippi, which might get the worst rap of the South. But I do think there is a lot to admire and to think about in Georgia in terms of what, where Alabama could go if it had the right leadership.
Progress as a whiplash. I like that. I've never thought about that. It's like you just get. Suyi? Okay, yeah, sure, that's fine.
Hi there, I'm Tanya. I'm just curious more about the form. You're considering it a memoir, and I'm assuming, I don't know.
Partly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm writing a memoir also, and I have a lot of, it's about the Gambia, my work in the Gambia, and I'm trying to incorporate a lot of history in it, and I'm really struggling with, like, what's my story, and how do I incorporate the history and telling other people's stories. And then I'm hearing, I haven't read your book, but I plan to, but you're talking about all these other people, and I'm just curious, how do you sort of choose how to weave, like, your story? I know, anyway, that's kind of, I'm just like thinking, God, how does she do that?
Yeah, I mean, it was the hardest part because the idea was, unlike my first book where I had like 4 separate stories, I wanted it to all read as a continuous narrative, even though I'm pulling in different people and myself, different moments in history. And so my sort of initial guiding thought was like, it's semi-chronological. Yeah,
When you realize that,
right.
you're like, oh, we started here.
Exactly. And then this idea of pulling in people and their stories when it makes sense on the timeline. You know, for example, when I'm starting, when it's like Creek territory, and then I'm pulling in that Indian chief, even though she's still alive, what's happened to her is quite contemporary. You know, trying to insert it in moments that make sense because the idea, I think my larger idea was I'm telling a story about a place, so that's my guiding structure, and the best way to do that is to kind of start where the place started and where it is now, and then everything has to serve that idea, and all the chapters have to be facets of that. I don't know if that's making sense, but it took a few tries, but it's just this, whatever your sort of your guiding principle is like the Gambia, and then, you know, maybe time might be the most useful structure, and then, pull in people, or structuring chapters based on different aspects of the place, and then pulling in people's stories and like that.
Yeah. So like space, time, there's a place, but then there's also sort of the historical depth that everything. So Stephanie's story is going to take us back to the 19th century.
Yes.
We can understand where she's coming from.
Exactly.
Sort of zipping through time, but space is always intersecting.
Exactly.
History
Exactly.
Sui.
My question was actually pretty much that question. The question of I was going to ask how you balance your primary sources by talking to people versus the secondary sources that you pull from for facts, statistics, etc. And I guess if you're thinking about this chronological structure, I guess my question is, when do you decide to pull in people in that? You know, you're talking about a very specific time period, for instance. You probably have a sort of a starting point of the facts of the time, etc. How do you then decide, okay, I'm pulling all these statistics and ideas from the secondary sources, books, etc. You get to a point where, how do you know the point where you say, and now I'm going to pull in someone, you know, a primary source to give this narrative, I don't know, some presence, some heft, etc. How do you know when it's time to do that is really the question.
I mean, part of that also has to do with my background, because since I am a journalist, my inclination is often, with stories, we do the opposite, where we're like leaning first with the human, then we pull in primary sources to bolster it. And so when I was doing it this opposite way for the book, I was hyper conscious of being like, wait, has too much time gone by where I don't have someone talking or appearing? And so I am very aware. I was even uncomfortable in some parts where I was like, you know, I had to necessarily have sections of history, and I was like, wait, is this going on too long? But it's necessary. But yeah, as a journalist, I always want to primarily feature people.
The human element, is like the total opposite to what we do in like literary scholarship. Is complete opposite. You start with the heavy stuff and you sort of stay there. and the human element is often missing. But there were some moments where I felt like you actually humanize history. So it's with the West African, the Clotilda. Is that how you say it? Like the way you brought it in, it was so abrupt, and it just made them like real people. You just, I remember maybe you stopped, it was around your dad's and mom's turn, and you just like, and then by the way, in West Africa,
Right.
so and so thing is happening. And even though it's this kind of distant narrative, they just felt so real at that moment. So where something that could have gotten lost as just like a historical detail really becomes very present and immediate and human for me.
Yeah. No, I think that when I was speaking of reading, further reading, the books that were most inspiring to me were nonfiction that felt like fiction, especially, and so, I mean, well, I do mention, Barracoon, obviously, which was a huge source, but, and people's memoirs, actually. A lot of memoirs about place were very helpful to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bhakti, and then. Sorry, just one more. Sorry, because we started, I know, I keep saying we started late as just a way to like get a little bit more time. But just one last question and then we'll be done.
Thank you, Alexis and Ainehi, for all the provocations. Congratulations, the book seems amazing, and I'm going to read it, of course. I just had a more kind of question around political identity and blackness as it's shaped in the U.S., which, as you know, is just functions on horrifying hierarchies that pits people against each other, And there is a sort of long-standing tension. There's also solidarity, but also tension between like an African American versus African. And over the years, there's been a lot of books that engage with that tension, like say the Hartman, Ya Jesse, all these works, and yours seems to be in line with that. And I just perhaps wanted to know where we are now. We also have this fairly new category, what we say black, what Black Lives Matter, really a surge in thinking about a sort of blackness across the board and things like that. I just wanted to know where you thought where people were in the US with regards to these kind of various identity points.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, again, growing up in Alabama, where I was very conscious of existing in both of these worlds, I've now realized through talking to other people was so different from people who had the same background but who grew up in New York and didn't think of themselves as just black, even if they had immigrants from wherever, Nigeria, wherever. And realizing that, of course, my experience was very different from my parents, who only later began to feel American, and I feel like the tension that they experienced being in the South, being at HBCU, then later staying in the South was a lot more acute than what I experienced as their child. And seeing people who are now younger than me who feel that even less, or who don't feel it at all, especially depending on what part of the country they're in, is fascinating to me because it's so much more fragmented and diverse and interesting, and I think that's only gonna increase. And probably it's not something, that people of my, parents' generation kind of would see, maybe expect to happen, but is natural. And, we were talking about, it's interesting. I think it's a lot more, but at the same time, I mean, this is such a big topic, but, there are groups who talk about, and it's true, there are discrete differences from being a descendant of enslaved people and of being of immigrants, and those differences need to be acknowledged and talked about, but I don't think that they should divide us.
Right, they shouldn't divide us. They are just what adds to the fact that we are not a monolithic.
Exactly.
There's no one blackness.
Exactly.
Nobody, and that we note our differences, but it just enriches what we are as opposed to now become like
Exactly.
points of difference. We're going to stop here. You can catch Alexis and pose your questions. Alexis, thank you very much. Should we go back to the question? Do you have something to say, or it's okay if you also don't have any? I did not mean to put you on the spot like that.
No. I mean, I think the memoirs, whether it's Sarah Broom or Joan Didion, or these people who wrote really memoirs about where they grew up, about their place, whether it's New Orleans or California or Texas, like those were really influential to me at the time. Yeah.
Alexis, thank you so much. It was amazing talking to you. Your book is
Thank you
beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for doing this beautiful work. The book is available on the book desk. Please grab a copy. That is one of the truest, most beautiful way to support a writer and their work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.